So going from, this assessment period where you're bringing that client, that athlete in, and moving into periodization, like Gen Pop client, fairly straightforward. Things get a little bit more specific when you are working with an athlete who has specific times in the year that they need to peak and perform. So, Carl, could you walk us through periodization for sports athletes and what that really means?
Yeah, so I'll kind of stick to the principles that we lay out and kind of talk about how those principles could be applied to one of these athletes. So the characteristics inside of each one of these things, right? Accumulation, intensification, pre-competition, competition, they're the same. The characteristics are the same, but now you just have to relate it to the competitive season or the competitive event. So when you start thinking about accumulation to start, like you want to put those things as far away as possible from the competitive event or the competitive season. So let's just continue talking about football. So I have an 18-week season sitting over here. I shouldn't be doing accumulation 2 weeks prior to that 18-week season, right? Like accumulation should be all the way over here, and accumulation should be thought about as a way to shore up any discrepancies in the characteristics that we talked about before, to hone in on skills if there's skill based things in the gym that those athletes could do, whether it's like reaction time under fatigue, things like that strength conditioning coaches would do, not like on the field stuff. It's an opportunity to build general preparedness, right? Where it's like you're just getting someone more fit, quote unquote, to get them into the intensity phases and the pre-competition phases. So it's just a precursor to intensity. So you're building the base, right? That's what accumulation is. So it's the same no matter what the sport is. The base is just different depending on what the sport is. And the base is different based on what you're doing inside of that sport. So for, that wide receiver, let's say the goal was to, let's say that wide receiver was very injury prone, right? Like they came off 2 seasons and, they tore an MCL and an ACL. You're thinking about, okay, I need to build the base around preventing these injuries. So what's inside of that program? I'm going to do a lot of structural work, a lot of single leg work. I'm going to do some agility work. I'm going to get them more prepared to take on force when they're cutting from here to here, right? So that's what building the base could be for that person. And then you can kind of just, come to a consensus of what the base would be for a wide receiver that didn't have knee injuries the past 2 years, and they're just getting like crushed off the line. They just need to get stronger, right? So building the base is building that baseline strength, right? So they could actually get into those intensification phases for a couple weeks, because you think about an 18-week season, you don't have a lot of time, right? So you're just preparing them for that one opportunity to get stronger, and then you're going into that pre-competition competition phase. So that would be accumulation.
All right. Into intensification. What's happening here?
Yeah, so when we look at intensification, this is where it gets a little weird, right? Because depending on what the sport is and what the sport calls for, intensity is going to mean something a little bit different. So when we look at, and I think CrossFit it was a good thing. It was a good like thought experiment of like breaking the rules of intensity, because classic models of intensification are low volume, high intensity, obviously, because it's an intensification period, and you just like it, you're training the CNS, right? So it's like it's nervous system training to get stronger. And then CrossFit broke that mold because intensity in CrossFit is actually doing more work. It's doing density. It's stacking things on top of each other. But no matter what the sport is, you want to ensure that your intensification phases are preparing you for your pre-competition phases. So accumulation looks nothing like the sport, right? You're building the base. Then we get into intensification, and it probably still doesn't look anything like the sport because we're strength conditioning coaches, right? But in those intensification phases, what are we doing? What is that client or that athlete doing in their sport world? They're getting ready for a training camp. They're getting ready for something, right? So in those intensification phases, they're probably on the field as well. So they're putting in work in their actual craft. So we can't take away from that in these intensification phases. So I would follow a very similar methodology of classic intensification, right? Like low volume, CNS preservation. We're not learning new skills. We're not taxing skills in a typical sport model. We're just we're getting them ready to go into that pre-competition phase.
And pre-competition is going to mirror the competitive season itself.
Yeah, yeah. So pre-competition for so let's stick with football, right? Like in that intensification phase, they were getting ready for training camp. Pre-competition phase, now they're in training camp, right? They're getting ready for their competitive season. So pre-competition, in terms of strength training, it looks very similar to what strength training is going to look like in competition. So we have to let the goal be the goal with these athletes and not put strength and conditioning over their sport. Classic models, we'd say pre-competition, we're honing the skills, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing a lot of work and training. In sports, it's not that. We're actually taking away from the weight room because they're doing a lot more on the field. So I think a lot of coaches get that confused, and they're like, okay, now we're getting ready for training camp. We need to go harder. We need to do this. We need to do that. And they don't consider what they're doing on the field, getting ready for training camp or in training camp at the moment. So, classic models, we're seeing athletes that are doing like 2-a-days on the field, right? So they're doing a lot of skill work. They're doing, gassers. They're running a lot. They're running a lot of plays. A lot of things are happening on the field. We can't take away from that in the weight room. So we can't just stack a bunch of intensity in the weight room, because what are they going to do? They're going to be in a hole in 2 weeks by the time the season comes, and they're just going to be trying to get out of that hole for the next 18 weeks.
So why even do strength and conditioning in that period if they're spending so much time on the field? And what would the goal be for doing?
The goal would just be to use strength and conditioning to keep readiness as high as possible throughout the pre-competitive and the competitive phase. That's it. And that means something different for most people, right? So, let's say it was that receiver that had a bunch of knee injuries, right? And they worked on a bunch of structural work, and you really focused on the lunge pattern specifically for that person. It's not losing what you gained in accumulation and intensification, and just, putting them through those patterns to make sure that they don't lose all of the great benefits that they gained. And in reality, a lot of athletes would do better if they limited the amount of time that they spent in the weight room. And they would also have to get so we're going into the competitive phase, but I think that's okay because the pre-comp phase will look very similar to competitive phase, but they're limiting the amount of hours that they're spending in the weight room because it's going to take away from recovery, and they're very, very specific in the days that they're going inside of the weight room. We talk about priority days all the time, right? It's like their priority days is whenever they have a game, right? So let's say there's that football player that has a game every Saturday, right? When are the best opportunities to get good training sessions in? It's either Sunday or Monday, right? I say either Sunday or Monday because a lot of players don't have the juice to get anything done on a Sunday. Like they're beat up. They just went through a car wreck. They can't walk on Sunday. So Monday is their greatest opportunity to get in the highest volume of training. And then they have to titrate that down and get ready for that Saturday again. So maybe, you have Monday is their high day, and then you have Wednesday as their medium day, and then you have Friday as like their preparation day, and then Saturday is their game day, and they're just rolling through a split like that throughout the season. And in reality, they're not putting in a lot of work, right? Like that athlete could have been doing in the accumulation phase, they could have been doing, 2-a-day training 5 days a week, and now they're doing 3 days. One of those days is just like getting them ready for game day, and the other one is like moderate volume. So they're only training really like actual training once a week. That's it.
Would you expect athletes to get weaker, less fit in the weight room during that period?
It takes a lot. It takes a lot for someone to get weaker. Yeah, it takes a lot for someone to get weaker. So, depending on how we classify less fit, yeah, maybe, but not absolute strength weaker. We don't have a lot of opportunities to test true strength, right? Like we use force plates and stuff like that to test like, how much power someone's putting out. But if we were to do classic like 1 rep max back squats, every Monday throughout the 18 weeks, they'll get weaker because they're just less recovered, right? Like the games take a toll and their bodies are just beat up. But absolute strength wise, not really, right? Especially if they have a well-designed program where they're hitting like, all patterns and they're hitting them fairly intensely once a week, they'll be fine.
This is less likely to happen at like a higher level, but with younger and less experienced, maybe less serious athletes who are still spending, a lot of time on the field, putting in a lot of effort there. How does a coach communicate to them that they need to dial it back during their competitive season, and that, being in the gym 5 days a week, hitting it hard is not beneficial, and just set up good expectations for that period?
Yeah, I think just for context, I was one of those people. Yeah, I mean, even at higher levels, I was one of those people that just like, I just overdid it. And I always found myself just hanging on for dear life at the tail end of every season, just hanging on. Just the way that I played the sport and the amount of time that I spent in like I would go in the weight room after a game, right after, like we would finish at 7 p.m., 7:30, I'm in the weight room, like just stupid. It just felt good up here though.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It felt good in my head. And it's just something that I just did, right? So I would tell people, hey, I made those stupid mistakes. Don't do it, because I was never able to hang on for an entire season and feel 110% throughout a season. But I would just say a coach just needs to tell them why, right? Like that's what someone never did to me. They never told me why. I had a really good strength conditioning coach, and I've talked about him a couple times on this. His name is Dan Laramie, and he was a Poliquin guy, and he was one of those dudes that was like, he rewarded hard work. You know what I mean? So I was always that guy that was like the hard worker, right? So that's why I did those things. But he never told me like, hey man, and honestly, he may have not have known that I was doing that, to be quite frank. But he never told me like, hey, dial it back because of X, Y, Z. As a strength conditioning coach, if you see an athlete doing that, you have to tell them the reasons why they need to dial it back and connect it to their ultimate goal. If someone's ultimate goal is to just go out on the field, play, and then go into the gym and feel good up here with going into the gym, like maybe that's okay for them. But if the ultimate goal is to be the highest level performer that they could possibly be on the field, then you just have to educate them on why going to the gym 5 days a week is probably not a good idea.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you'd add on competitive period?
No, just understand the principles of periodization and where the competitive season is or where the event is, and just work your way back from there, and always err on the side of doing too little.
Yeah.
Because once you spill over, it's really hard to come back. And, for someone like a fighter, right, if you spill over and you have too intensive training camp, they're going to lose. You know what I mean? They don't have another opportunity next week. So I would always err on the side of doing a little bit too little, and learning if they came in under conditioned, learn and then titrate that up just a little bit in their next training camp. But once you spill over, you're not coming back.
Immediately following the season, are you putting someone in a deload, and is that something that varies, athlete to athlete?
Yeah,
or?
It definitely varies athlete to athlete or sport to sport and what the season looks like. A lot of sports, there's not a lot of quote unquote off season. You look at a sport like football that extends, into December, January, and those guys are going back to mini camps in like March, April. You know what I mean? So, for people like that, or, for collegiate athletes that their season ends and then they're getting ready for the next level. So they're participating in like combines and and they need to be fit and ready to go by March. And they just played in a bowl game in January. That window is here, but you have to fight that urge to get them back in too quick, because the same idea of spilling over in that pre-competition phase. You can do the same thing coming out of a competition phase, and you could just set them up for a disastrous off season if you get back at it too quick. So I would always just recommend that people just step away from physical activity for an amount of time, especially if it's a very long and exhaustive season. A lot of athletes just need the mental break. It's just like go on vacation for a week and don't touch a weight, don't sprint, don't do anything. Come back and let's have a conversation and reassess and see if you're ready to go. If you're not ready to go, let's take one more week. Don't do anything. Come back. You're not going to come back fatter, weaker. Like you're not going to lose it all. The first couple of days may feel a little shitty, but we'll whip you back in shape, and you'll have an adequate amount of recovery to do that. But yeah, I mean, in periodization, I think to end that conversation, you just got to put the sport first. Like it's so easy for us as coaches to think that the weight room is the most important thing, and that's a rabbit hole that we don't want to fall into. The sport is the most important thing, and some of the best athletes in the world are absolutely trash in the weight room. What does that tell us? That tells us that A doesn't always equal B. Sometimes you can get to B without A, but you just need to ensure as a strength conditioning coach that you're not making them worse at B.